Welcome to Massachusetts in the Civil War podcast, Episode 2. Today we will discuss the first Battle of Bull Run that occurred on July 21st, 1861, and the Mass regiments that fought there. My name is Mike Murphy, and I will be your host. The first Battle of Bull Run, or the First Battle of Manassas, was the first great land battle of the American Civil War. With the firing of Fort Sumter and the call to arms by both Abraham Lincoln in the North and Jefferson Davis in the South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas joined the Confederacy, and the South moved their capital to Richmond, Virginia, some 100 miles south of Washington, D.C. As the eager men of both sides concentrated around their capitals, many were called up for only 3-month enlistments, and as July 1861 drew near, some of those enlistments were ready to end. The need to move became paramount. The Northern Army was led by Brigadier General Irvin McDowell, a West Point trained staff officer who had little experience commanding men in the field. However, there were few experienced officers that had the resume needed for what was about to happen. Facing McDowell was his West Point classmate, General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, at Manassas Junction, along with General Joseph E. Johnston and his army in the Shenandoah Valley. General Johnston was technically the higher-ranking officer at Bull Run. However, he decided to allow Beauregard to keep command and follow through on his battle plan. Both commands were approximately equal in number, with 30 to 35,000 men at the height of the battle. Both commands had the same battle plan, and both armies were filled with men who were anxious to end the war in one winner-take-all battle. Among the men in the Federal Army were 3 regiments from Massachusetts: the 1st, the 5th, and the 11th Regiments. Each regiment had a totally different experience in this one-day battle. The Massachusetts 1st Volunteer Regiment was placed in the 1st Division, 4th Brigade, commanded by Colonel Robert Cowden. Colonel Cowden was originally from Vermont, but moved to Massachusetts when he was 20 and served in the state militia for 22 years. He would lead the men of the 1st Massachusetts in the Battle of Bull Run through the Peninsula Campaign in 1862 before being promoted to Brigadier General in charge of the defense of Washington, D.C. However, his promotion was never endorsed by Governor Andrew of Massachusetts and never confirmed by Congress. Thus, he was discharged from the service and returned to Massachusetts. The 5th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment was a militia unit before the war that was activated 3 different times. Under the command of Colonel Samuel Lawrence, a political appointee, they served a 90-day enlistment at the beginning of the war and fought at the Battle of First Bull Run, where Colonel Lawrence was wounded. They were activated for a 9-month enlistment in 1862, serving in North Carolina and seeing minor action. Lastly, they served a 100-day enlistment in 1864, detached for guard duty around Washington, D.C., mostly at Fort McHenry of the War of 1812 fame. In 1861, they were placed in the 1st Brigade of the 3rd Division. The regiment would suffer extreme casualties during the battle and would return home shortly after. Colonel Lawrence would not serve as the commander during the next 2 enlistments. The 11th Massachusetts was commanded by another militia officer, Colonel George Clark, Jr. When the regiment moved south, they were placed in the 1st Brigade of the 3rd Division and fought with poise and discipline in spite of what turned out to be a panicked rout of Federal troops. Colonel Clark soon after resigned his commission as he was too sickly for the rigors of command and returned home to Massachusetts with an honorable discharge. The Battle of First Bull Run was a rush campaign fought by mainly Green troops with not enough formal training. After marching approximately 40 miles on a hot and humid July 21st, 1861, the Federal Army came face to face with a more rested enemy. Although less in number, it was commanded by the hero of Sumter, General P.G.T. Beauregard. What General McDowell did not know was that General Joe Johnston was close by in the Shenandoah Valley with another army already prepared to leave and aid Beauregard, and with the access to the railroad. By the late afternoon of July 21st, the men from General Johnston had reached the battlefield at Manassas Junction and routed the Federal forces. The 1st Massachusetts was the first hometown regiment to see action during the Bull Run campaign. On July 18th, they were sent out on skirmish duty near Blackburn's Ford to find the Confederate flank. In an attempt to cross the river, they were fired upon by the enemy and forced back. The resistance made General McDowell find another place to ford the river. During the battle, 3 companies of the 1st Massachusetts were the first to engage the Confederates. With both sides wearing gray uniforms, it became confusing as to who was shooting at who. After discovering that the Confederate forces were a significant force, approximately 5,000 men, the 1st Massachusetts and other units were ordered to retreat. The action suffered 83 casualties altogether. The 5th Massachusetts was ordered to Sudley Ford early in the morning of July 21st, where they eventually crossed in the afternoon. They obeyed the orders even though their enlistment had actually expired. They were ordered to Henry Hill west of the Stone Bridge and positioned in the center of the line between Stone House and Henry Hill House and in front of the Warrington Pike. It was there that General Jackson's men arrived on the battlefield and held their position against the Federal advance. Moreover, it was there that General Bernard B. of South Carolina yelled to his fleeing men the line that gave Jackson the moniker of Stonewall. "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer. Rally behind the Virginians." Shortly after, he was mortally wounded and died the next day. Regiment day was short, as once they arrived at Henry Hill, they crossed a large open field in fine fashion in spite of being exposed to Confederate artillery. Reaching the other side and the hill, they held for as long as they could until forced to withdraw by Confederate reinforcements still arriving from the Shenandoah Valley. While still there, a Confederate shell ripped into a tree, sending fragments everywhere, including into Colonel Lawrence. Left for dead from those around him, his adjutant went back and rescued him. He put Lawrence onto an ambulance wagon and managed to get him to Washington alive. He survived, however. The injury ended Lawrence's military career. The 11th Massachusetts was positioned next to their sister regiment, the 5th, supporting a battery. Unlike many other regiments that day, the 11th left their packs and other non-essential equipment back at camp and arrived at Manassas Junction in much better condition than most. Yet that didn't help them initially. When wearing their brand new gray uniforms, they were fired upon by Federal troops, mistaking them as Confederates and losing several men before the mistake was realized. With the battle underway, the 11th broke through the woods heading south around 11 a.m. and struck at the rebel flank, forcing it back about 2 miles. Then the enemy decided to make a stand when reinforcements arrived from the Shenandoah Valley. The men from the regiment hit the ground to avoid the Confederate artillery fire for a while until Colonel Clark received orders to support Colonel Ricketts' battery. Arriving too late, by the time they got there, Ricketts' battery had been captured and in control of the rebels. However, taking the enemy by surprise again, the regiment was able to recapture the cannon and ground they stood on. But there they stood without support as the Confederates continued to enter the field until finally it was forced to fall back and join in the overall retreat of McDowell's army. The last regiments to leave the field that day, the 11th marched off handsomely. The Confederate artillery stubbornly attempted to keep the running Federal army on this side of the Bull Run River by aiming for the bridges that spanned it. In the midst of the panic, the Stone Bridge was hit with a shell, causing even more panic. Men, horses, wagons, and civilians clogged the road, forcing the men from the north to attempt crossing the river, many of whom were drowned or picked off by Confederate sharpshooters. The 11th Mass got back to Centerville and back to their original camp at Sutter's Hill the next day. They had brought back its colors and regimental banners, with a loss of 21 killed, 37 wounded, and 30 missing, presumed taken prisoner. The repercussions of this battle were that it was obvious that General McDowell was not the man to lead the Federal Army. and that the war would not be a one-and-done affair. Preparations would have to be made for a long, drawn-out conflict. President Lincoln immediately called for 300,000 three-year enlistments from the northern states and appointed Major General George McClellan to lead the newly named Army of the Potomac. McClellan was just the type of organizer and disciplinarian that our new army needed at that point. As for the Massachusetts regiments, the 1st and the 11th stayed with the Army, while the 5th went home, its 90-day enlistment having been completed. However, all would fight again.